We're recording this on August the 16th, 1996. We're talking with Stan Linnertz, an individual who has been in radio and television for a number of years in Lincoln and Grand Island and has served as a chairman of the board of directors, president of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association in the late 1980s. Stan, to try to recall some of those periods of times, let's talk a little bit about first just the bracket of time when you started in radio and moved into television. When did you start in radio?
Well, it started in radio back in the. That's an interesting question, Larry. We can edit and cut. Can we? Let me think about that. 1965, about 1970.
1970. Okay, and that station that you started.
Well, Larry, we started, interestingly enough, I came out of a retail background and met a fellow who had developed some commercials for a bookstore that I was with, and Norton Warner. And Norton said to me one day, "Have you ever thought about being in radio?" And I said, "Well, I tried it one time in North Dakota, where I come from." The fellow turned to me and said, "Well, you'll never make it." He says, "You're an asthmatic alto." And Norton said, "Well, I hadn't thought of making you an air personality, but if you'd like to, well, why don't you come on over? I own a station, just bought a station." He came over from Kimball, Nebraska, and he said, "I've got KLIN AM and FM." And I said, "Oh, that sounds kind of interesting." And he was full of enthusiasm and ideas, and so I went to KLIN as the vice president of Warner Broadcasting. And as I've told you before, Larry, I didn't know a tower from a watt, but Norton said, there's 8 stations in the market in Lincoln, and we're about 12th or 13th. And we've got to figure out how to make this puppy go. And so we just, the exciting part of that, I think, is Norton Warner probably had the greatest background for sales and concepts of how to put things to go and make them happen of anybody that I've ever worked with. His understanding of the process of sales was outstanding, and so we just started knocking on doors and selling KLIN, and there was a hot air balloon event I'll never forget in town, and I went to Norty and I said, why don't we fly across the city of Lincoln and do traffic reports in a hot air balloon? And Norton said, "Yeah, sounds good to me." So I got up and we put a microphone in the hot air balloon and did reports. And so that started a long process. Norton said to me one day that I hold true today, that is in any business and all the consulting I do around the United States, that the radio station, I think it's true of television, I think it's true of a lot of businesses, they should reflect, they should be like a mirror on the community. I think if I was going to teach broadcast, I'd talk about the property being and the reflection, the mirror of the community. And I suspect if I was going to sum something up, I took that, I looked Norton in the eye, and I thought, "Holy Hannah, that's a piece of truth. I'd never heard that before." And we ran out and got involved in the children's zoo. I never forget, I rode the zoo train for 8 hours and raised $11,000. And we went from that and put together the Holmes Lake 4th of July celebration. And I talked the Lincoln Park Service into we put a pontoon, the KLIN pontoon battleship, out on Holmes Lake, and we got the Dairy Association to give us ice cream bars, and so we'd pull up and give away ice cream bars on the 4th of July out to Holmes Lake. And we can go on, and I suppose those were exciting times, and what happened was that Norton, with all of his ability, put together a crew of people who were just absolutely dedicated and focused. Another thing that I picked up there was the word effective, doing the right task at the right time. And being effective was something that Norton understood very well, and so we just one thing went to another. Don Gill, one of the premier broadcasters that I have ever known, not only a broadcaster but a journalist, and those aren't always two of them tied together. And I'll never forget Don said to me, we were sitting around talking, and we were doing Nebraska football. And he said, boy, he said, we need to do some things. And I said, and whether he mentioned it or I or whomever, but we talked about doing sideline broadcasting. And then we talked about doing it wireless, so we could go not only from the sideline, but going out in the parking lot and talking to the people who were frying their chicken out by their camper. And I said, Don, I don't know, my voice, you know, they call me the asthmatic alto. And he said, and you know, Don's got a great set of pipes, but he said, why don't we do this? And they'd strap me up, and I think it was Don that coined the idea. We'll just call you Mr. Showbiz. And I liked Mr. Showbiz a whole lot better than I liked the asthmatic alto. And so we had a pair of red jumpsuit that said Mr. Showbiz on it, and boy, you know, I would have worn that today if I hadn't thrown it away a few years ago, Larry. But we went around town, and consequently, Larry, KLIN moved to be one of the premier broadcast properties in Nebraska, and I learned a great deal from Norton Warner. And I tell you, before we get away from radio, little story I need to tell about competition. You know, when we started KLIN, and we were, I don't know if we had. I don't know who was listening, but the big hitter in town was KFOR, and Roger Larson was the guy, was the manager. And Norton and I used to say, boy, that Roger Larson, I wonder if we could get him out of town. How can we get rid of Roger Larson? And I thought, well, I'm just going to watch. What does Roger Larson do? So I'd go to chamber things, you know, and I just know a country boy from North Dakota, and I'd watch old Roger, and I mean, he'd shake hands, and he'd be at this chamber thing, and he would be at a concert, and so I pretty soon I said, hey, I don't think Roger, I never said this to Roger, I'd stand back and I'd just watch him, and I'd say, now what is Roger Larson doing? And how can I emulate and learn from him? And I have a great deal of respect for many broadcasters. I mentioned Norton, Don Gill. Roger Larson, to me, was a perfect example of somebody who understood the market, understood the people in the market and the community, and exploited it. And I don't mean to say exploit in a derogatory term, but just took advantage of it. And to me was unknown to him probably, but was a great teacher to me. And so we became, I think, very competitive with OR at the time, and became more secure. I'll never forget they had a salesperson, and I was also selling at the time. They had a salesperson, Vince Colera. Vince was taller than I was, bigger than I was. And I wanted him, and Vince would look me right in the eye and say, Stan, this is my account. I don't think I want you selling that account. So I said, I got to learn from Vince Colera. And I did, and there are people, and I can't go on and on with this, we'll run out of tape, but I feel strongly, and I'll mention this again before we finish, Larry. I feel strongly about what I learned from guys like Don Gill and Norton and Roger Larson and Vince Colera, and Gay Cole was another salesperson over at OR. And not only was that advantageous to me in broadcast, but when I left broadcast, started my own business, worked in the consulting field and did some other things, it carries to this day. There are things that I carry with me to this day and get up when I speak that I learned from those people 30 years ago. And I guess that's a message that I would have.
Now, Stan, at one point you left the radio business to went into the television business. Tell us about your years in television.
I left KLIN and went over to KLN KGIN in 1980, and it had a lot to do with my ego and another great personality. I have to pause when I think about A. James Ebel. I probably, of the half a dozen people I've known in my life, affected me more than anybody but my parents.
He was the president and general manager of the station.
Jim Ebel was the president and general manager of KLN KGIN, a pioneer in broadcast. Had been with the Fetzer Corporation for many years, and he said to me, Bob Schinelli, who had managed the KGIN part of that and had a stroke, and Bob Schinelli is a story in himself. And Bob had a stroke, and Jim said to me, why don't you come on over to KGIN and manage that Grand Island station? And I said, boy, I don't know, I'm pretty happy in Lincoln. But he said, have you ever been in front of a television camera? He said, and you could do parades, and boy, my head was just, and Jim was just, he was a very quiet master. He said, why don't you and I go for a ride? And Jim took me on a ride, and we looked at towers. Jim was an engineer, and we looked at towers, and he sold me on it. And I went out to Grand Island and managed the KGIN section. And he said, I want you to do the same thing that you were doing in Lincoln, and that's hold a mirror over not just one community, but over Grand Island and Kearney and Hastings and North Platte. We were a regional television station. And he said, let's reflect what's going on. And I tell you, my tummy just bounced along, and I said, boy, oh boy, we drove out there, and again, what's exciting about broadcast, Larry, is the people that give you the opportunity. I never understand somebody that says, well, I'm just going to do this or I'm no. Look at the opportunity expand. And we did, parades. I'd never done a parade in my life. I didn't know a parade from Sikkim. And we would do the Harvest of Harmony Parade.
From Grand Island.
In Grand Island. And Jan Thayer and I do the Harvest of Harmony Parade. There was maybe 105 high school bands would come to Grand Island in October. And these little guys, they'd get up in Valentine and Grant and all over the state, and they'd drive in those little yellow buses all morning long so they get to Grand Island and march 5 miles, see. And you'd see, I'll never forget, I have that picture to this day of this little guy, tuba player from Valentine, small band from Valentine. And the tuba is larger than he is, and his hat's crooked, and he's marched 3 miles, and he's just playing this tuba. It was, I almost bring tears to my eyes watching these kids in the Harvest of Harmony Parade. Then we did Husker Harvest Days, and I suppose one of the big things that we did that was exciting was Nebraska Land Days. And Mr. Ebel said,
in North Platte.
In North Platte. He said, why don't you go down to North Platte? Let's see if we can't capture. Jim always said public service is great and you can make money at public service. Demonstrate to the community that you are a committed broadcaster. That's part of in broadcasting in my day was that you were involved with the community, you served the community, and by serving the community, you sold advertising. And we did Nebraska Land Days and interviewed all kinds of famous people, and then I looked and I said, why can't we do the wireless sideline broadcast at the Nebraska Land Days Parade, just like Don Gill and I did it at the Husker football games? And so I loved it. I got out of the booth, and I put this old mic on, and I'd run along these horses, and I'd jump on these floats and talk to folks. And so we again took we used to float down the Niobrara River and shoot footage and bring it back and talk about the essence of the state of Nebraska. And Jim Ebel was, to me, an outstanding person, an outstanding broadcaster, and his contribution to the people who worked for him and to his state probably never can be calculated. I just, the man, I admire him more than I could say.
What kind of audience response, people in the community, did you get to television in that period of time, which is in the 1980s?
Oh, well, we, now you're dealing with my ego, but, well, first of all, KGIN was the #1 station. I mean, there wasn't, I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. We just blew everybody away. We just kicked a lot of butt. And you know, we would drive to Valentine. We would go out, and Jim said, you never know who's going to get that book on the, you know, the
Rating book.
who was ever going to get that to rate you, and so the Arbitron. And we would just work those communities and contribute and be involved. And our audiences were always, of course, our 10 o'clock news with Mel Maines was always #1. But there wasn't a place that I could go. I never forget Bob Schinelli and I used to go, and his ego was much larger than mine even. He was a big personality. But he'd say, let's see if we can go in this restaurant that anybody would recognize us. And we always got people talking about Channel 1011 and talking about Mr. Evil and talking about Lita Powell Drake, talking about Dale Holt, all contributors. And the warm fuzzies, I used to call them warm fuzzies. People would say, would you come to my community and talk? Could you do this? And what were this? And the recognition factor was unbelievable. In fact, I didn't realize till I got out of the business. And I was doing workshops in South Dakota, and a person came up and said, I used to watch you on television. And I'd give him a $5 bill. No. But, Larry, so you know, I can drift a bit, but the bottom line to this is I feel so strongly about a commitment to the community and what it returns. I just think that was our answer both in radio and television.
Now, Stan, the KGIN is a part of the 10-11 combination, and it is, in the parlance of the business, often described as a satellite station because although it was a full power station with its own license and its own community and so forth, it was linked directly to the Lincoln station. So how did the satellite operation work with the so-called main station?
Well, first of all, we had a complement at one time. We had 3 news people at KGIN. We had 2 engineers at KGIN. We had, I suspect, 14 to 15 employees out there, and how we developed that. Obviously, we sold advertising, and that ran on the day parts, just like the advertising they sold in Lincoln. Mr. Ebel was very adamant about that license. He would say to me, "That license is vitally important to us." And so when we went live, and we went live with lots of activities, those would go in day parts and run and be run through the tower and brought back to Lincoln and then brought back through the state. If that answers the question that you wanted.
You mentioned some names of some television personalities at that period of time and how they were accepted by the audience. How do you relate to that when people go out and they talk to you and they say, we really like the newscast or whatever? How do you assess that when you are the sales representative?
Oh, well, as an example, Husker Harvest Days. Get our friend Mel Maines to come out to Husker Harvest Days. And there would be lines. We'd have the Channel 1011 tent. There would be lines of people waiting to shake Mel Maines' hand and talk to him and introduce their children. How do I relate that to sales? Well, I have to tell you that the guy standing in line has the John Deere dealership in East Overshoe, Nebraska, or in Grand Island, or wherever, or has a business, and he has watched Mel Maines for 15 or 20 years, and Mel Maines is nice. Mel would come out there and it would be raining. I just had to keep him full of hamburgers. That's all. And he did that at Nebraska Land Days. Mel Maines would come out to Nebraska Land Days, lead a pile break. Let's not, I'll tell you, a fellow who was loved was Dale Holt. I mean, he had, when you talk about warm fuzzies, Dale Holt was a personality that people, and the Mel Maines, they trusted him. Dale Holt, they trusted him. He did the community thing and the public service thing. And when that comes to sales, there is I'm not on the air. I'm on the air. I'm not a salesperson. Aha, el contraire. That comes together like this. Mel Maines and Dale Holt and Lita Powell Drake and others that we could always sold lots of advertising. Not just because they were on the air, but because they were part of the community and because they delivered that mirror that we talked about that reflected what was the activities and things going on in people's lives.
How much of the budget for local sales was supposed to come from the Channel 11 area?
How much of a
20% or 50% or 10%, how much of the overall money that they wanted to have for income was supposed to come from Channel 11 as opposed to from the Channel 10? If that's something that they broke out, maybe they didn't.
Oh, we probably, Larry, if we looked at the advertising business, agencies, 21, 22%, 23.
And was that approximately the same population that was served by the Channel 11 signal compared to the Channel 10 signal? Was it like 80% of the population in Channel 10 area?
Yes, yeah.
And 20% of the
There
Channel
would
11
be,
area?
there would be, I don't want to, I have to think about that a little bit, but I think you're here we served the city of Lincoln and out there, and I think that was pretty accurate, yes.
You mentioned the Channel 11 license being vital to the corporation. Why was it vital?
Well, it was the tail that wagged the dog. Again, if we were going to compete with Omaha, if the Omaha signal was coming into Lincoln, the Omaha television stations, when we were out in the hinterland or out in what we call Metro 2,
The rating term.
rating terms, that license made the station. Now, we're just old country folks out there in Grand Island, but let me tell you, that license was the key. Because whatever books were out there, the population was only a fraction, but we delivered that population and we delivered the books. And when you take a look at that 10 o'clock breakout on rating books, KGIN is the real hammer, the tail that wagged the dog.
Talk about the other stations in central Nebraska that competed with KGIN, because you also had some experience with NTV.
Yes.
The Kearney station, which had a repeater or satellite stations
Right,
in two other
right,
locations, another big signal area.
Right,
How did those stations fit in terms of the overall viewing audience for people?
Well, I thought of those stations, Larry, Channel 5 in Hastings, KHAS, really found their niche. You know, they were a local station. There wasn't any, didn't schmooze anybody a lot. They just delivered what they had over there, and did a good job. And I think they were pretty profitable. NTV, probably one of the most abused broadcast properties in the state, had a big market and never. Now I'm speaking of when I was there. I can't relate to it now, but it was a factor, but never was managed well enough to be competitive. I relate it to anything I've ever done that's competitive. If you want to get up and play ball with me, I learned from Roger Larson and Norton Warner. You best be getting up early in the morning, and they had the tools, didn't use them.
Yeah.
And when I was spent a short amount of time at NTV, and it had great opportunity, but a person came in, spent some dollars, and left in the dead of the night, and so I have to admit that if somebody ever grabs a hold of that property, they may be doing that now. I have to be careful because I don't watch that market. But there wasn't a lot of competition, I have to admit, and Jim Ebel gave us a great deal of latitude to create that market, and that's the other thing. If you would run with the ball, and he allowed you to do that, and you were always out looking how to capture the market, how to capture the community. We belong to 15 chambers of commerce. I went to annual meetings. I called Jim, what do you think? Do I have to go to the Axtell Chamber? Stan, get in your car and drive over there to that Chamber of Commerce meeting and shake those hands. That license is key. How many people, Larry, in the broadcast industry, I sometimes see these folks, they just, as Jim would say, they just don't work the room well enough.
Now, about this period of time when you were spending time in television, you became a member of the board of directors of the Broadcasters Association, and subsequently became the chairman of the board of directors, the president, essentially, of the association. Talk a little bit about how the industry leadership was operating at that time.
Well, that brought the Broadcasters Board is an interesting story in itself. It brought together people from all over the state, people who had bought a radio station with the last buck they had in their pocket, people who were network folks, who come from L.A. to run the big hitters in Omaha. A fellow I admire, talking about Larry Rice. There's another fellow I learned from, consummate broadcaster.
Larry Rice from Ainsworth.
Larry Rice from Ainsworth. People should go to school on Larry Rice from Ainsworth if they want to run a small town radio station. He should publish a book. He's on the air in the morning. He sold. But what did he do? The same thing that Norton Warner and A. James Ebel did. He believed in his community.
And he became the president of the association after you did.
The year after I
did.
And so you brought all of those people together. And I've managed, as president of the Lincoln School Board and other groups, I thought managed some fairly tough meetings. When you get a bunch of broadcasters in a room, my ego included, there's lots of egos and lots of folks who have some strong opinions. And I suspect that I'm proudest of being able to manage that. And it was an industry in change from becoming stations that were independently owned, or at least owned by local businesses, to being bought by groups from out of state. And the small television and the small radio station trying to find their market because the retail business started to change. The big regional retailers came in, and then some of the radio stations in the larger communities would overlap with some of these smaller stations. And then how do we, as broadcasters, how do we make our case? How do we make our case for our contribution? And that was not always easy. the politics changed. And you know, we used to go to Washington, D.C. and shake a few hands, and we tried to be involved in different aspects of the state. And Larry, I guess the Drugs Don't Work campaign would be an example that I'd like to fuss with.
Yeah, talk about that, Stan, because that happened with your leadership. You really put that on track.
Well, we had it was something I was interested in. It's not. I mean, the nub of the idea didn't come from me originally, but I had worked with a drug program when I was on the Lincoln Board of Education, and again we looked at what is our opportunity as broadcasters to serve and to contribute. And at the time, the governor, Kay Orr, Harold LeGrand, who was the superintendent of the Nebraska Highway Patrol, was interested in developing a program to create some awareness of the downside of drug usage. And Larry Rice was very instrumental in that process, and we met with the governor's office several times. The program is an ongoing program to this day, and probably because it happened on my watch, allow me to be a bit egotistical. Probably one of the best programs the Nebraska broadcasters ever been involved with. And if I was to hang a plaque on my wall, I wish I had a plaque to that because I think it's a great contribution. What happened, and I think that the important thing again is that we were a mirror and a reflection of what the community in the state wanted to say. And the governor's office and the state broadcasters said, hey, we can make a contribution and we can come together and develop a program that creates awareness not only for young people, but for adults and for grandparents and talking about drugs being a dead end. And I again, that program in itself is great, but the other side of that, Larry, is that we should never miss an opportunity as broadcasters and as community leaders to be able to come together to better serve the public.
Now, for the purposes of the tape, Stan, we need to talk a little bit about the specifics. How did the program work?
Well, we had.
How does the program work? It continues.
Well, okay. How does the program work? Well, the program, Karen Walklin writes the script and does some production for the program. But what we had gotten originally was an agreement from radio and television stations to run the schedules. We then developed
Without cost.
Without cost. And I mean, a substantial program. This is not running one at midnight when the Great Dane dog is the only one that's watching. And so we've got a substantial schedule at no cost. We got some excellent production help at no cost. We had the state contributed some dollars and some public relations effort out of the governor's office. And we also worked with Peggy Briggs over the Department of Tourism and Economic Development. And brought that package together, and then the Nebraska Broadcasters Association and the exec mailed out the tapes to the different stations, and the strongest commitment I've ever seen for a program from the broadcasters than when I was involved.
What's the difference of having a statewide association under your leadership take on a unified campaign like this as opposed to the individual station operator doing his or her own situation?
Well, there are some stations that can facilitate that, but when you take an association and you move them as a group, I mean, it's like holding hands around the table. You're going, we have a common vision. A common vision. Drugs don't work. We can close our eyes. I can see it. I can still see that. And so you take that power that television and radio stations had. Then you take the commitment of people who are concerned about the problems of drugs and alcohol. You take the political community who understands the need to be involved. And now you have a program as you drive across the state and you punch up station A or station B or station C, or you turn it on your television set, wherever I've been in a motel room across the state or a hotel or a friend's house, I can punch up and I still see that commercial. And every time I see that, I turn to my children and say, aha, see what Pop did, help do. And the power, Larry, if you say, what does this station do versus the whole state, it's just the power that it delivers to every time you turn a corner. It's there, the message is there, the message is there, the message is there. Drugs don't work, drugs don't work. If we just affect just a small fraction of people, just a small attitude, we can walk away and say we have made a difference. And Larry, when we get finished with this, what else is there in life than to say that I have contributed to the quality of life of both of the state and the people that I've touched? That's what broadcasters get to do. That's what I miss about broadcasting. That's what they can contribute to the quality of life and change people's lives for the better because they touch so many people.
How about the governmental leaders? You mentioned Governor Orr and Colonel LeGrand and so forth. How did they view you as the broadcaster with this kind of an effort, this kind of a campaign as an adjunct to their responsibilities?
Well, initially, Governor Orr was very positive about it from the start. I think I certainly not going to mention, we did have initially, there were some, as I did in the Lincoln Public School System when we first started that program. People who want to hide their head in the sand and say denial. In Nebraska, nobody smokes pot. Or, and I'm going, no, wait a minute. And so we did trump in a few halls and have to knock on a few doors. Once the governor knew where we were going, once the State Highway Patrol, Harold LeGrand, it wasn't difficult. Initially, there was a few barriers, but I have to admit that the mechanics of it was probably a little tougher to start with than getting the people to put their arms around you and getting the program done. And there are a few folks who are in a constant state of denial, and you just got to leave them behind.
Stan, also at this period of time, as I understand it, in the association allowed state legislators to come up with their own agendas, their own ideas, and to record or tape some of the materials saying this is what is important to me in the legislative session, and that was broadcast.
Yes, well, that again, a reflection of what is going on, and all of those things, Larry. And it's interesting. That had slipped right by me, but.
Well, talk a little bit about what it is before we talk about the significance of it.
What happened, and I think Larry Walklin and I walked up and down the halls with some tapes over at the State House, and someone had the idea. I don't know if it was Larry Walklin or who it was.
No.
That I can't recall.
Charlie Brogan, I think, was one of the people
Charlie
who did
Brogan.
That. Yes.
That's it. Charlie Brogan from Lexington.
But who was the president of the association in 1996. But at the time when you were in charge, you essentially maneuvered that idea to be able to make it work. And the issue is really for us right here is, how did it work?
I'm trying to recall that, Larry. Well, when Charlie Brogan brought up that idea, and again, the key was a lot of good ideas fall by the wayside, and we asked state legislators to talk about things that were happening that were important to them. No cut, no, as I recall, no edit. No, this is it. This is what. Hey, we're not trying to tell you what to do. And that was one of the beauties of the program, is that they could get in front of the mic and tell it as it is. And then we wrapped that, took that back from the office, and shipped it out to the local radio stations, and they could play that, and they could listen to their legislator, and hear exactly what he or she felt about what was happening at the State House.
Now you mentioned that you walked around the halls and gave the copies of their finished remarks with the open and close and so forth on it to the legislators. Talk about why you did that.
Well, one of the, when we went up and down those halls looking for offices, and Larry Walklin and I split those tapes up and walked in. Well, there's a couple of reasons. I don't know why anybody else did it. One was I wanted them to see and listen to their tape, and two, I wanted to meet the state legislator. I wanted to shake his hand. I mean, God's given me X number of talents, I think, and one of them was I want to look you right in the eye, shake your hand, and say, I'm Stan Linnertz, I'm flat proud to be a broadcaster, and here's a tape, and let him understand what we're about and the opportunity that we had given him or her. How
important is it for a professional association like the broadcasters to have some degree of rapport with the governor's office and with state legislators?
It's vital. Larry, if broadcasters, I can only speak to the broadcasters, say, if we are going to, if we have a mission of profitability, of contributing to our community and to our state, it is vital that the broadcaster make his or her needs known to the governor's office. Also, it is vital for the broadcaster to make those contributions, like the tapes of the state legislators or the Drugs Don't Work program. We are making a big mistake if we are not out talking to state legislators, talking to the governor's office, talking to the movers and shakers, and because part of that, if it goes back to that archaic cliche of mine, Larry, of holding the mirror over the state of Nebraska, if we don't look the governor in the eye, or our state legislator in the eye, or the state auditor in the eye, and we don't talk to them, how do we understand what's going on, or how do they understand the philosophy of the broadcasters?
During the late 1980s, when you were on the board of directors, when you were the president and chairman in the 1989-90, how did you feel that there was cooperation, appreciation, or opposition from state public officials?
I think that when we talk about cooperation for state and public officials, I think that was my experience in the governor's office. I go back to J.J. Exon. His was excellent. I think K.O.R. was excellent. Charlie Thone was excellent. I think most of the governors, we've always gotten good response from. When there are legislators sometimes who possibly did not see the same vision that we saw, or the same importance as that we affixed to our industry. I guess overall, I would say the cooperation, if you worked it, but let's not pull any punches here, Larry. If you worked it and contributed, it's a two-way street. You got to shake the hands, and then you got to contribute. I thought it was always good.
You mentioned also about going to Washington, D.C. and calling on United States senators, members of the House of Representatives, and so forth, that as a leader of the Broadcasters Association. So the follow-up question then is, how do you see the influence or the rapport of broadcasters with elected federal officials during the time that you were most interested in?
Well, having worked with governors when they were governors, and then worked with them when they became senators, there is some change. But again, whether it's Bob Kerry or Jim Exton, two come to my mind, who always were most open and understood the importance of broadcasting, and were committed to their state. I think you have to fly the flag. As broadcasters, if we have a commitment to our community and our state, we also have a commitment to get out and talk to the elected officials and find out what they're about and in the direction in which they're going. Most of that, so much of that legislation affects the people back in the area where our stations are located.
How much appreciation did you find of Nebraska or out of the East Coast issues when you dealt with political officials? In other words, some people say that in Washington, D.C., the Congress regulates broadcasting by the stations that they see in Washington, D.C., and yet, of course, you're dealing with individuals who are senators and members of the House of Representatives who are from Nebraska. When you talk to them about Nebraska needs and Nebraska broadcasting, how do you assess their perception of Nebraska broadcasting?
Well, I always think, I come about this in a roundabout way, I guess, Larry. I always remember when I was on the National Committee for Excellence in Rural Education, a guy from the National Department of Education, when I was a broadcaster, came up to me in Washington, D.C. and said, you only have one community that is not rural in Nebraska. Oh, I said. He said, yeah, that's Omaha. The rest of you all rural. And it's like it was an affliction. I said, well, is that the same thing as measles? And the guy just turned around and walked away from it. But I felt that that we always had to fight that image problem of if we were talking outside of our own delegation, that it was difficult sometimes to get them to, because they didn't view us as having the numbers, or they had a very strange perception sometimes of who we were and what we were in Nebraska.
Now, Stan, you described yourself in some ways, I think, as an idea guy, a marketing guy, a management person, an individual who was trained basically in leadership, and you enjoyed transferring that to broadcasting. And although you've talked a little bit about the fact that you've done a fair amount of on-the-air presentation, you've never classified yourself as your primary job as an on-the-air presenter or announcer or newscaster or whatever. But in terms of your working in the community, the kinds of things you've described here, how important was it for the people in the community to have seen you on television or heard you on radio?
Oh, Larry, it was a piece of magic. I have to say that, we go back to people telling Stan, you can't make it broadcast because you're an asthmatic alto. But the truth of the matter is, when I went on the air and got involved in the community, whether it was parades or the Children's Zoo or the Lincoln General Fashion Show, and I can go on and on and on. It was, and I ran for public office, and I was elected.
The school board in Lincoln.
The school board, ran twice. It was, the broadcast was instrumental. And when and so I don't take too much time with this, Larry, but when I left broadcast, somewhat with a broken heart, but when I left broadcast, and years later, to this day, 8 years later, I have people come up to me and say, Stan, I always remember you from doing this or doing that. And one of the things, Larry, how vital the sales side of that is. When I started my own business, today I have just signed one of the largest contracts I ever signed to work with a marketing and a sales department for a national corporation. That contract came about because that man and his wife and a friend of his went on a University of Kansas basketball trip that Don Gill and I organized 20 years ago. Tom Osborne had me do a workshop for his football coaches because he thought highly of what Don Gill, Norton Warner, and Stan Linnertz did when they were broadcasting. It goes on and on and on. And I just give you those two examples. I can continue. It is, if you sell it right, if you commit yourself to your community and to your profession, broadcasting will open doors that just, it's unbelievable.
When you were a public official, when you were on the school board,
That's right.
How did being a broadcaster help you deal with, encourage school policy?
Well, I had, you have to be a little careful with that, but I never made any bones about, I'd go out in the community and we'd have people call in. I did a Saturday morning radio show, and people call in and ask me issues about the Board of Education, and I'd talk about it. As long as I wasn't running for the office, we felt comfortable doing that. We would go out in the evenings to grade schools, and we would tape some of them for air, and I would answer questions. I think that I had a good feel for the community. That sounds egotistical, I guess, but the broadcasting allowed me to understand and get that vision, that mirror of the community and what people wanted. I think it's a great tool to allow people to see what's going on in their specific town, and it made me a better board member.
How do you assess the people that worked for the school board, essentially as professionals, not the elected officials, in their understanding of openness in broadcasting?
The people in the school district themselves, administrators?
The administrators. When you as a board member came in and talked with them and you said, I'm in the public information business here, I'm in the radio business, and I want things to be open. How did they respond to you?
Well, we had a superintendent by the name of John Prosh, who, again, one of those people that had an open mind. Outside of John, that flat make folks nervous, because the board, let's tell it as it is, and I'm sorry. It has nothing to do with the ability to educate. It has the ability to only want certain kinds of information out in the public. And my concept is, let's hang it out there. And as a broadcaster, I'm going to, if it's something that affects the public, if it affects the future of my children and my grandchildren, I got news for you. I want it on the air. And that's the way I was when I was on the board.
Stan, before we end the time that we bartered with you for today, that you talked about a number of broadcasters that are folks that have come to mind, Jimmy Bullen, Norton Warner, and Roger Larson, and Bob Schinelli and others. Anybody else that we haven't talked about so far that you'd like to kind of put in for historical context?
Well, I guess I think of folks that I mentioned. I never forget this. you know, there are a lot of people in broadcast that don't get in front of a camera and in front of a microphone. And, you know, it's all of the salespeople that you see. And I'll never forget, there was a fellow by the name of Gay Cole at KFOR who did a lot of work for Roger Larson, who was a community activist in his own right.
You mentioned also, I think, Ed Schaefer, who was executive director of the
Well,
Broadcasting Association.
Ed Schaefer, there wouldn't be a plaque big enough in my mind. I mean, Ed Schaefer, who came out of the Union Pacific, understood people, understood, and got some criticism from time to time. He was one of the most honest, caring people that I have ever been associated with. Ed Schaefer, if Ed Schaefer said that's where it's at, as when I was chaired the broadcasters, if Ed Schaefer said that's where it's at, that's where it was at. I trusted the man, I trust him today. A true, just some of those exceptional people that you meet in your life. I've been touched, I suppose, in my lifetime by maybe a couple of dozen folks that I'll wake up at night and I think about Ed Schaefer and Jim Ebel and Norton Warner and I did a Let's Get Growing gardening show with started the Backyard Farmer.
Wayne Whitney?
Wayne
Whitney?
Whitney. Started the Backyard Farmer, Wayne Whitney. We did a Let's Get Growing show. I know we're running out of tape, but Let's Get Growing. We took that show. Wayne Whitney was a horticulturist, and we talked about doing a gardening show on Sunday morning. And Wayne said, why don't we take it to people's backyard? And I said, that's great. And we did. And you know, the beauty of radio, Wayne would pick up that dirt and people would say, or pick up that tomato, and I'd have people come up to me later and say, you know, I could see that tomato. I could see that, I could feel that dirt that Wayne Whitney picked up and that Let's Get Growing show. And we went all over the city. We got, I can't remember, we got a couple of awards for that thing, and it's still going today, I believe. And Wayne Whitney was one of those giants in the business too. But lots of great people have touched me, and I would hope that I have contributed and touched them back.
Yeah, that's probably an excellent place for us to end, Stan. You've done a good job getting a lot of information very quickly. Again, this is August 16th, 1996. We've been talking with Stan Linnertz.